Talking to my teenager. Developmental Psychology in Adolescence. Lesson 1. Adolescence, a critical period of development. Why critical? Teenagers are the first to experience the difficulties of this age, but parents are also at risk of having difficult years when their children go through this stage. In the next lesson, we propose the main changes that adolescents face at this delicate stage of development. We also offer some useful pointers to understanding those aspects of functioning that are often little known, both by parents and by teenagers themselves. Age. Adolescence begins around the age of 12 and ends around the age of 18. Compared to life cycle classifications of a few years ago, adolescence is considered to start earlier and end later due to contextual factors such as less economic stability and a longer period of time devoted to vocational training. In addition, the timing of psychophysical maturation varies for boys and girls. Thus, adolescence currently begins around the age of 10-11 in boys and 9-13 in girls, while late adolescence has slipped to around 20, for some even 23-25. The factors that mark the entry into this phase are hormonal changes. The phases of adolescence. Adolescence is a long and particularly rich period of change. For this reason, we tend to divide it into three phases, each of which is characterized by specific psychophysical and social transformations and different developmental tasks. Pre-adolescence, 10-14 years. Mainly characterized by physical changes that result in the need to establish a new relationship with one's body. It is all about building a self-image more in line with the new appearance. The sexual experience of physical intimacy with other people also begins. Adolescence, 14-17 years. The pivotal time when social relationships between self and others are structured. This consists of emancipation from the family unit and the development of new relationships with the peer group. Late adolescence, 17-20 years. The final stage of maturation. The representative task of this phase concerns the construction of one's own identity, for example, the relationship with oneself. The teenage years are known to be complicated and emotionally difficult. At a time when they don't yet know quite who they are, let alone who they want to be, teenagers have to make important choices that will affect their future, such as their school career. Let's not forget, at the same time, the environment around the teenager changes to adapt to their needs. School, family, and peer group all put pressure on the teenager to become an adult and as such, an autonomous and independent person. The role played by the relationship between the internet and teenagers is also increasingly important. Adolescence and physical change. Puberty begins during adolescence. It corresponds to the beginning of physical and psychological transformation, which then ends with the attainment of full sexual maturity. Puberty is biologically programmed and determined before we are born. The role of hormones. This development is hormonally induced by the release of a hormone, responsible for activating hormones that stimulate sexual maturation. It's still not 100% certain, but most likely the process is triggered by a certain amount of body fat. It follows that overweight boys mature sexually earlier than normal weight boys, who in turn develop earlier than underweight boys. Other factors that seem to influence sexual development are sleep, changes in light and temperature, and stressful life events. Relationship with the body. Hormones lead to the development of secondary sexual characteristics such as hair, breast, or testicular growth, voice changes, and the ugly acne of youth. Meanwhile, the body grows taller and looks more and more like an adult. These elements radically alter the adolescent's appearance. In fact, the main task of the pre-adolescent phase is precisely to integrate these new elements into the prettiest body schema to make it more consistent with the current appearance. Curiosities. During puberty, certain symptoms may appear that indicate an intersex condition. A very common behavior in teenagers is to constantly observe themselves in the mirror. Control of their own image is at the center of attention at this stage. Teenagers are constantly comparing themselves with their peers, asking for confirmation of their body and tending to feel ashamed of certain details of their image in general. Disorders such as enuresis, bedwetting, present in adolescence can cause serious self-esteem problems. This may seem silly to parents who tend not to identify with their children because they weren't like that at that age. Parents worry, thinking their teenager has serious problems. It's actually a behavior which can occur in teenagers. Let's keep in mind that times are changing at a frightening speed and that the teenage years of 10 years ago are not comparable to what is happening today, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. Similarly, future teenagers will have different characteristics from today. Today, we live in what is called the narcissism society, where self-enhancement is at the center of existence. What does the narcissistic society entail? It involves a much higher level of attention to one's own body and how it appears to others. It is important to be looked at and above all to be liked. Appearance is also shaped sexually, as the first attempts to share intimacy occur at this stage. All this is beyond the individual's control, who feels obliged to conform to the canons of the narcissistic society of which he is a part, which is also extremely tiring because it takes up a lot of his time and energy. The adolescent lives in a kind of adolescent egocentrism. For this they have to appear perfect, otherwise others will notice their flaws. Feelings of constant insecurity can easily undermine self-esteem and cognitive and psychological well-being. It can lead to eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating, somatization, a psychologically determined illness, or body dysmorphia, an obsessive-compulsive disorder that causes adolescents to believe their own bodies don't look good. Symptoms of anxiety, depression, and panic attacks occur. Adolescence and emotional change. Adolescence is experienced by many as an unhappy phase of life because of body shame. In general, all emotions are perceived as particularly intense and cause the teenager to act more impulsively than adults. Teenage impatience. It is a factor less understood by adults and therefore a source of frustration. This is because the brain structures for logical reasoning and impulse control are still incomplete. They do not fully mature until around the age of 18-20. Therefore, at an early stage, the adolescent does not have the cognitive means to deal rationally with situations. They are therefore guided by their emotions. In other words, he is easily absorbed by the negative experiences of others. Adolescence and cognitive change. Adolescence is a time of significant cognitive change. During this period of life, there is a big qualitative leap in reasoning processes. In fact, until around the age of 12, children have a concrete-based way of thinking, while later on they begin to develop a formal or hypothetical deductive way of thinking, more similar to that of adults. Self-harm. In response to negative emotional experiences, some adolescents may implement dysfunctional coping strategies in an attempt to make themselves feel a little better. Among those most commonly used in adolescence are drugs with anesthetic and antidepressant effects. The most commonly used modality is self-cutting, which has the dual function of reducing psychological pain. Physical pain triggers the release of endorphins, or happy hormones, produced by the body itself. Teenagers find physical pain more acceptable than psychological discomfort. They feel more entitled to suffer if the cause is physical. Moreover, cutting, like many other modes of self-injury, makes pain more real because it moves it from the inside out. How does the brain work in adolescence? On the one hand, the teenager gradually acquires higher-order cognitive skills such as metacognition, the ability to reflect on oneself. But on the other hand, he or she does not yet have adequate mentalization skills. For example, the ability to understand what he or she is thinking and what others are thinking. If we add high emotional activation, it explains why at this stage they experience strong psychological and emotional instability. Role of the prefrontal cortex. This area is a regulatory component that allows dialogue between emotional impulses and logical reasoning. For the adolescent, it mediates between what the instincts want and external reality, allowing them to adapt effectively to the environment. In practice, the prefrontal cortex is involved in decision making. The prefrontal cortex plays an active role in setting priorities and long-term goals. The prefrontal cortex is involved in problem solving based on assessing the situation and identifying possible consequences of actions. The prefrontal cortex holds in memory the information needed to perform a task, as it is the seat of working memory. The prefrontal cortex directs attention and goal orientation. In adolescence, this area is not yet sufficiently developed. This is why teenagers have behavioral manifestations specific to this period. Emotional regulation helps to tolerate negative emotions, such as frustration or feelings of failure, and reduces impulsivity in favor of reasoning. Anger is also part of adolescence. Teenagers, in fact, tend to put off meeting their needs, especially if they are emotional, and make hasty choices that turn out to be dysfunctional in the long run. This is why adolescent behavior is guided mainly by instinct and emotion rather than rationality. Adolescence and morality. Another typical developmental task of adolescence is to choose and structure one's own value system, which partially takes over those transmitted by the family of origin and integrates them with others developed independently. To do this, the adolescent relies on new learning models, such as teachers, sports coaches, etc. During adolescence, a fundamental step in the evolution of morality takes place. For example, the criteria by which one judges what is right and what is not right. Adolescence and identity. In all this process of change, the evolutionary task par excellence of adolescence, and especially late adolescence, is about constructing one's identity. The adolescent tries to define who he is for himself and for others. For example, to assume a position in the context in which he lives. To understand who he is, how he would like to be, and how others think he is, he has to go through two processes simultaneously. Differentiation. He must distinguish himself from the collective in order to emerge as an individual. Affiliation. creating one's place in society based on the dynamics of belonging that one develops. Dear parents, in order to assume his or her own identity, a young person must necessarily detach himself or herself from the family unit of origin, investing all his or her resources in the peer group. I know in the eyes of parents, the child is always their own child. However, teenagers need friends to understand who they are. Peers reflect the image teenagers have of themselves, while parents still reflect their childlike self. Parents, treat your teenagers like adults. Avoid treating them as if they were still children. The role of parents in this delicate phase of change plays a crucial and absolutely delicate role. On the one hand, they have to support the child in his or her own development, and on the other, they have to learn to give the child more and more space as he or she develops autonomy. Renegotiating roles between children and parents is a key element in this process. It is not easy, which is why experienced parent trainers are sometimes needed. Don't worry, parents, you are not alone in that hell called adolescence. Thanks for watching this lesson. We invite you to watch the next lesson, number 2, in which we will present on personality and behavior in adolescence.